The next question we're looking to answer is the three crops that were grown on plantations in Saint Dominique. So what did they grow and then ship out? The colony of Saint Dominique, which is now Haiti, existed for over 100 years. For much of that time, it was the wealthiest colony, had the most cash and very strong economically in the Caribbean. By the mid 1700s, it was the world's largest sugar exporter. Okay, so here's one of the answers right here for sugar exporters. So you want to take on your study guide under number 3A, put sugar. In order for French planters to sustain such dramatic growth, they depended on the African slave trade for ever-increasing numbers of slaves. The growth of both Saint Dominique's economy and its slave population in the latter part of the 18th century far exceeded other Caribbean colonies. Some historians have suggested that this burst in growth may be one reason why a slave revolt was successful in Saint Dominique and not elsewhere. So this is getting at, it keeps giving us clues as to why the revolution, why it was successful, why were the slaves able to take the country back for themselves. It's almost like foreshadowing. So this is one thing, one aspect that's going to help it be successful, was they were so successful with all of these crops they were growing that they needed more slaves. So there were many, many slaves on the island. How did Saint Dominique's economy develop? European colonies in the Caribbean were truly global economies, which means they shipped and moved products all over the globe. This is the first time it's really done that around this time period on Earth. In Saint Dominique, as in other Caribbean colonies, slaves from Africa reaped the wealth of the Caribbean for the benefit of Europe. So the slaves are doing all the work, and who's benefiting? Europe. All goods produced in Saint Dominique were sent to France, where they were re-exported to other European countries. So first they went to France, and then they shipped them to other countries, and other countries gave them the cash for it. Saint Dominique quickly became a crucial part of the French economy. The French devoted nearly all land in Saint Dominique to plantations, growing mainly sugar, coffee, and tobacco. Nice, here's the three. So question number 3, under B and C, you're going to put coffee and tobacco. Tobacco is cigarettes for smoking, and you know what coffee and sugar is. In creating their plantation empire, the French developed a sophisticated infrastructure system, building roads and water systems throughout the colony. So the French are also putting in all these roads, to make it more easy to ship all these products out and to handle the plantations. They also cleared huge amounts of forests. This ends up being devastating for Haiti, even to this day. So they cleared out all these forests to make space for crops. This began the widespread deforestation. This was one of the words in the vocab. So you see the word forest in the middle. So their deforestation is taking all the trees out of the forest, like getting rid of the forest. Of the western side of the island, a problem that continues to plague Haiti today. Throughout the 18th century, the economic needs of Saint Dominique put a great deal of strain on the land and led to struggles over control of the border region with Spanish Santo Domingo. So this is still an issue, too, where the border is between Haiti and DR. For most of Saint Dominique's French-born planters, Saint Dominique was a colony of production rather than a colony of residence. That just means the purpose of Saint Dominique was just to grow things and ship them out. People didn't really want to go there and live there. So they hired people to go there and run the plantations, and they would just get the money for it. To administrate their properties while they remained in France. I don't know why they wouldn't want to live there. It's beautiful. Only the planters born on the island tended to live on their own plantations. By 1791, there were only about 32,000 whites in the colony as compared to 500,000 slaves. So this is the next question. I'm going to highlight that. So if you look, it says in 1791, how many slaves lived in St. Dominique and how many whites lived in St. Dominique. So these questions are all going to help you when we further look at the revolution. So it's very important that you get it down. So this was for the crops, sugar, coffee, and tobacco. And now for how many slaves lived in St. Dominique? 500,000 enslaved people. How many whites lived in St. Dominique? 32,000. So you can see there that there's a lot more slaves than people who aren't slaves. The next question we are looking for is, why were some enslaved people considered elite? So it's almost saying that some of the slaves were considered higher up than other slaves. So there was like a hierarchy amongst slaves. So we're looking for that next. The economy of St. Dominique grew explosively and quickly became France's most lucrative colony. By 1789, there were more than 7,000 plantations producing indigo, coffee, cotton, cocoa, tobacco, and sugar. The wealth of the colony depended on the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved workers. Remember, we talked about labor and how the whites believed that they had a right to the labor of these slaves. In fact, many planters at the time described their wealth not in terms of money or land, but by the number of slaves that they owned. Although purchasing a slave was expensive, colonial trade was so profitable, they made so much money in this colonial trade that they didn't even hesitate to work their slaves to death. How was life for enslaved people in St. Dominique, which I think, okay, this is where it's going to get into why were some of them considered elite. Although numbers vary widely, historians estimate that well over 700,000 Africans were brought to St. Dominique between 1700 and 1791. Most were from the Congo region in present-day Angola, while some were from as far away as Mozambique in Southeast Africa. The religious practices, agricultural techniques, languages, political ideas, and military knowledge of these enslaved Africans heavily influenced colonial society. So the knowledge of all these slaves influenced what the society was like. They also gave shape to the mass revolution that overtook the colony at the end of the 18th century. So again, this is another foreshadowing, like everything that the Africans came over with, all this knowledge is going to help them overtake the colony. Life for enslaved people consisted of dangerous work in the mills or backbreaking work in the fields. They generally rose before dawn and finished after dark. Some owners did not provide their slaves with enough food. At times, enslaved people struggled or negotiated with their owners to receive small plots of land that they could work in their free time to grow their own crops. So because they didn't have enough food, they said, please just give me some land and I can plant some crops so I can feed myself or their families like more food, because they weren't giving them enough food. In their free time, which wasn't a lot, they had to do that. How is the community of enslaved people in St. Dominique diverse? This is where it gets into the elite part. On the eve of the revolution, about 2/3 of enslaved people were African born. Because 5 to 10% of slaves in the colony died each year due to disease, malnutrition, and brutal work conditions, planters constantly needed to import more. At the same time, as the century progressed, production on the island increased and the demand for more labor skyrocketed. So this again is just talking about how they needed more and more slaves. The number of slaves imported increased from about 2,000 per year in 1725 to nearly 48,000 per year in 1790. Some estimate that as many as 50% of all slaves brought to St. Dominique arrived in the 15 years leading up to the revolution. So again, more foreshadowing. Enslaved people came from many cultures and spoke a variety of languages. While most were born in Africa, many were born on the island. These slaves tended to be better off than first-generation slaves. In part, this was because they were more accustomed to growing their own crops and selling the surplus. Slaves born on the island also tended to have more family ties and practice Catholicism, which is like the Catholic Christianity, although this was often used to disguise voodoo religious practices. So they would pretend they were acting Catholic, but they had this other religion, voodoo religion, that they were really practicing. Some enslaved people were considered elite, so this is what we're getting at for this next question. These were the slaves given positions of authority, for example, as domestics working in estate homes. So that would be like someone who helps with the housework and the cooking, so they were considered higher up. And then commandeurs or drivers who supervised groups of workers, so they were like a manager of slaves, but they were also a slave themselves. Or as artisans, like carpenters and blacksmiths. Most of the elite were born on the island. Planters considered them to be reliable and trustworthy. Many of these same elite later used their positions of power to become some of the revolution's most effective leaders and organizers. So again, this is going to be important, these elite slaves to the revolution.